Hello and welcome to LearnHowToQuilt.com's Star Sampler series. Today you'll learn a different method for making this blazing star. In the last video of this series, you learned how to put this together using templates. Today you'll see how you can use paper piecing to sew together this block. Hope you stay tuned. To get started, you'll need to choose 5 different fabrics to make this blazing star. The more contrast you have between the fabrics, the more you'll notice the 3D effect in this star. For example, over here I've used all golds for the stars. There's a lot of contrast between these two fabrics and very little contrast between these two. Notice that the star jumps out more in this combo than it does in these low contrasting fabrics. Neither combo is wrong. I just want you to be aware of what happens when you pick strong contrasting fabric. Try coloring in one of these patterns to get an idea of what your star will look like with the fabric that you choose. To make this star, you'll need 4 pattern pieces like this and 4 pattern pieces like this. You'll sew these together into 4 sections and then sew the sections together to make this star. In an earlier video in this series, I went over how to draft this block, and then you learned how to draw up these paper piecing patterns. If drafting a block isn't your thing, you'll find links to these free patterns below, or you can go to LearnHowToQuilt.com and click on the Free Patterns tab. To get started, you'll need 4 copies of this pattern. You'll want to cut these patterns out. It doesn't have to be perfect. I like to get some of this excess off on the sides. Next, you'll want to crease these black lines here. What I like to do is put this up alongside of a ruler to get that crease in there, or sometimes I use a greeting card. You just have to crease these lines in the center here. You don't have to worry about the outside line. Now, some folks like to draw in this line all the way to the outside edge. But you can see that's not necessary if you can see where the crease line is. Paper piecing is a great technique to learn, especially if you don't like dealing with these long, skinny triangle points. I find that I can sew much more accurately when I paper piece. You see, you just sew right on those lines. You might be saying, wow, this sounds easy, and it is. But it can get very confusing because while you're sewing on the front, your fabric goes on the back of the paper. And you really have to think how to place this fabric. These patterns may look alike, but they're actually mirror images of each other. So while this gold fabric works on the back of this pattern, it doesn't work on this pattern because it's the opposite. It's also confusing when you want to get these fabrics in the right places. I want the light red here and the dark red there, the light blue here and the dark blue there. So you can see I've marked my patterns where the lights and the darks go. If I sew dark fabric on the back of this pattern piece, I get something that looks like this. It doesn't match up to this section here. It actually ends up being in the opposite position, which is okay because both of these pieces have been reversed. But if you have your heart set on your fabric choices looking like this, then you'll want to pay careful attention when numbering your fabric. I think the easiest solution to this problem is to just do the opposite. So if this is light, then over here on the pattern, it's going to be dark. If this is dark red over here, it's going to be light. If this is dark blue here, over here it's going to be light, and this one's going to be dark. Before you get started, make sure all your fabric's been pressed. Now I'm just going to go with these 2 that I made earlier. Fabric number 1 is this gold. Fabric number 2 is this darker blue. And fabric number 3 is this lighter red. Fabric number 4 is this gold. Fabric number 5 is this lighter blue, and fabric number 6 is the darker red. Another great thing about paper piecing that I didn't mention earlier is that you don't have to be precise when you cut out your fabric. You just need to cut a piece big enough to cover this number 1 spot along with this outside seam allowance. So if I went and cut a piece out like this, definitely fits over that spot. But if I turn this over on the back, then this is actually the reverse. And so that wouldn't work. So what I like to do is take this over to my fabric, fold that line right there. And I can cut this with scissors, or I can just use my rotary cutter. And then I'll fold this piece down right here. Cut like that. And here's my first piece that I'll place on the back of my fabric. So I want to make sure that this piece covers this number 1 shape here. So I can do that by holding it up to a light source, put a flashlight behind it. You can see that the fabric goes past these dark lines. So that's going to be good. I'll pin that in place. So after I've pinned it in place, I like to fold this down, and it's not necessary, but sometimes it makes it a little bit easier when you go to put the next piece on if you trim this down to about 1/4 inch. So I'm ready for fabric number 2. So fabric number 2 is this blue, and I see that I'm not going to use my rotary cutter. I'm just going to use my scissors. And I see that this piece needs to be, about this big. So this piece will go right here. But when I sew, I want to put right sides together. Now, I want to make sure that when I sew this seam and flip this back, that I have enough fabric here. So what I like to do, usually on the first couple that I sew, once I do a couple of these, then I kind of see where the fabric needs to go, and I don't need to do this anymore. But in the beginning, what I like to do is pin that sew line. So I'm pretending like I just sewed down that line, and when I flip my fabric back, I want to make sure that that fabric covers over here, and it does, that it covers on the end here, and that there's enough extra up here for seam allowance, and there is. I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine now, readjust these pins to pin it like this. I'll start sewing outside of the dashed line onto this dark line, and then I'll sew 1 to 2 stitches beyond. So I want to show you what that looks like. I started outside of this dashed line. I just followed the black line all the way to the end, and I sewed a few stitches past. Now I'm using red thread so you can see, but you'll want to use more neutral colored thread. So I'll take this over to the ironing board and press. Make sure you're using glass head pins, not plastic head pins, because the plastic will melt if you accidentally hit it with the iron. So before I add piece number 3, I like to fold this back. You can see these stitches might hinder that, but don't worry if a couple come out. When you sew across this line, you'll lock them back in. I'm going to trim this to about 1/4 inch. I could use my rotary cutter, but I'm just going to use my scissors for now. And I've already cut fabric number 2, this piece right here. I'm going to put right sides together, then pin down this line just to double check to make sure that I've got everything in the right place when I sew. I'm going to flip this back, and I want to make sure that this piece covers all the way to that dotted line. You see, it just barely makes it down here. Just remember, these long skinny triangles are a little tricky when you flip it over. Sometimes it looks like the piece is much bigger than you need, but when you flip it back, you're short down here. So just be aware of that. So I started sewing past this dashed line, all the way down the solid black line, and out past the dashed line on this side. And now I'm ready to trim. I'm going to use my rotary cutter. You can use your scissors, but I want to show you what happens. This is kind of floppy. So if you decide to use your scissors, I would keep this pinned while you're cutting with your scissors. With the rotary cutter, since it's down up against this board, it doesn't flop around so much. And here's my 1, 2, 3 paper piecing unit. This half of the paper piecing pattern pretty much goes together just like this first half. While making this section, I want to give you some tips that aren't necessary but might save you some time and fabric. So we'll start with fabric number 4, which is this gold piece. So when you paper piece, you don't have to worry so much about these straight of grain arrows because the paper acts as a stabilizer for all of that bias. However, I like to tear off my paper before sewing sections together, and that means I lose my stabilizer. I want to make sure that the straight of grain and the cross grain are on these outside edges. So when I go to cut my fabric here, I'll try to place it on the straight of grain or cross grain. Now this isn't the fabric that I used in the quilt. I'm just going to use this as an example because it's got the selvage edge here. On this fabric, I had to go and stretch fabric and see where that straight of grain and cross grain was by pulling the fabric to see where it didn't stretch. So to cut this piece so the straight of grain and cross grain end up here, take the pattern and put it on top of the fabric, line this edge up, fold this back, and either cut this with your scissors by eyeballing about a 1/4 inch seam, or you can use your rotary cutter. Fold the paper back, and I can either leave this or trim it off. And there's my piece. That'll go on the back side here, and I'll have that straight of grain or cross grain on this outside edge. So you'll place fabric number 4 on the back of the pattern and then pin in place. Or sometimes what I like to do is to keep a washable glue stick nearby and just put a little dab, maybe in 3 different spots on that pattern, just enough to hold it in place. Then I don't have to worry about melting these pin tops. Fold this back. It's not necessary, but it makes it a little bit easier to get that next piece on. You trim this down to about a 1/4 inch. Now I'm ready for fabric number 5, which is this light blue. If they want the straight of grain along this edge, then I can turn this over, line that up with the selvage, and cut. Now I want to get rid of some of this selvage here. So let's trim that off. Remember, this piece doesn't have to be perfect. I just want to make sure that it's going to fit on this side. And it does. Now to save fabric, I can use this piece sort of as a template. Remember, this doesn't have to be perfect. You want it to be a little bit bigger than you need. Instead of cutting these pieces out individually, it goes much faster. Cut them all at the same time. And see, I don't even need to use that ruler because these don't have to be perfect. Piece number 5 will go right there. It'll end up looking something like this when it's been sewn together, but to sew it, I have to put right sides together. So let me check and see. Here's that line, and I need to have seam allowance over here. That looks good. Here's another seam line. I'm above that. And let's look over here. I'm above that. But just to be sure, until I sew a couple of these together, I'm going to pin it on that sew line. Let me pull this over. This is what it's going to look like when I sew it together. So let's turn this to the back, and I've cleared that line, and I've cleared that line, and I have enough extra on the edge here for seam allowance. So let me take this over and sew. So I stitched on the line between 4 and 5, and then I pressed. Fabric number 6 is going to go up here. I could fold this down and trim to 1/4 of an inch like I did in the first section, but it's not necessary. So let me show you what happens if you don't trim. So fabric number 6 is going to go right here, and I'll need to put right sides together before sewing. So let me turn this over, and I'll have enough fabric for the seam allowance here. I come over here, and it looks like I'll have enough fabric up there. So I'm still not sure about where everything needs to go, so let me pin this to double check. I'll turn this over, flip this back, and let's see if everything's in order. Oh, I'm just barely right on the edge there, so I've always got to remember that that's going to be the tricky point when I sew these together. So I've sewn this line and then press fabric number 6 back. I'm ready to trim. Make sure the 1/4 inch line on your ruler ends up over this dark line. You'll need to make 2 more of these for your star. When all of your pieces have been completed, you'll want to lay out your block. The next step is to sew each set of triangles together. Now, some folks like to leave the paper on like this, pin the sections together, although it's difficult with this paper, and then they take it over and stitch. What I like to do is take the paper off at this point. So you want to do this gently, because remember, we're dealing with bias edges here. So this is the one that I glued on. And there, if you just put a little dab of glue, it'll come off pretty easy. Once you take off one side, then you can easily come down the other side. Here's that dab of glue. It comes off pretty easy. If it doesn't, you can just wet it and the glue will dissolve. There's another dab. And here's my last piece. I find that after these 2 pieces have been taken off, I can come in the middle here and pull it off. I don't have to deal with this edge here so much. And if you end up with little pieces of paper like this, you get tweezers to take them out, or try with your nails. Okay, so I have the paper off of that one. Just a reminder to get started, put your finger over the thread and give it a little tug. Once you get inside here, then this next step is pretty easy. This wants to just sort of fall away. At this point, I can put these 2 together, but I need to match right here, and I like to have opposing seams. So I'm going to go back and repress this seam. When I do that, I get a little ear here. So let's just get rid of that. Now I can put right sides together, and you'll see that these will match up rather nicely. Pull this back to make sure those seams are up against each other. You can feel them nestle in there, and pin. Now down here, this is going to be a little bit of a problem. I can't repress these seams. I'm just going to have to deal with the bulk down here. So I'll try to get them as close. So I'll try to get them as close as possible, and I'll pin. I'll take this over to be sewn. I've got this seam matching here, and then down here, it might be off just a little, but I think that'll do. I'll sew each of these sets together in the same manner. Before I go any further, I like to check to make sure that all of my pieces measure 6.5 inches. I also like to make sure that this seam ends up exactly in that corner for each one of these pieces, because when I go to match that, if these seams aren't in the corner, then the center will be off. Another thing to look at are these rays in the corner here. They should meet about 1/4 of an inch from the edge, and you can see that this goes a little bit longer. Now I can tear that out. I have to be careful because that's all bias, and readjust to see if I can get them a little bit closer, like I did on this one here. I stitched over about a 1/16, get them a little closer together, or I can just leave it as is. So you want to sew these two sections together by putting right sides together. Now I have opposing seams here because I always press that last seam towards this dark piece. This last seam was pressed towards the dark blue piece. So I have opposing seams here. Get my pins out and pin that. I'll come down to the edge here on this red. I can see that I've also got opposing seams down here. So I'll get that to nestle in together and pin. Now I'm ready to sew these two sections together. I need to match these points here and these seams on either end. I put right sides together, and then I want to match these seams here. Now here's a problem that I haven't talked about earlier. I can see that I didn't press this seam very well. So I need to go back to the ironing board and repress this. And now I've got a problem where this is going to stick out. But I'm not going to worry about that right now. I just want to get these seams nestled up against each other, and I'll pin. When I stitch along this edge, I'll use this piece of fabric to guide my foot. To match these points in the center, I like to take a pin and come up through this point and then go right into this point so that they're right on top of each other. I also think it's important to have opposing seams here so I can feel when they're nestled in up against each other, and then I'll pin. And here's my completed block. Thanks for visiting learnhowtoquilt.com. Hope you'll stay tuned for the next video in this series.